Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. We're recording this, by the way, on March 15th, the Ides of March, Idus Martinez. What a great time to be talking about Latin. My guest today is Lucy Banduk, Latin teacher extraordinaire, former chair of the language department here at Trinity. She's been teaching languages for the last 40 years. Born and raised in Brazil, she speaks Portuguese and English fluently and Italian with a smattering of Japanese, French, and Spanish, and of course, Latin. For 30 of those 40 years, Latin. Fun thing about Mrs. Banduk, she grew up in Brazil. So English is her second language, yet her fluency in English is so strong you would not even be aware of this. She loves movies. She grew up on Westerns, especially because her dad loved John Wayne, the Duke. She also loves the Beatles, who taught her a lot of English through music. She would write their lyrics down, and her dad would translate them for her. Lucy, you just gave a Trinity U lecture. I came, I saw, I spoke Latin. For those who couldn't attend, we'd like to hear just a brief recap. So, first of all, where did your love of languages come from?
Hi, thank you for having me, first of all.
It's great to have you.
And I noticed that you were wearing a Beatles t-shirt. I guess it's because I told you about the Beatles today.
Indeed, that's right.
Interesting. And yes, as you mentioned, my love for languages did start with my dad and also my mom. My dad had to learn English because he worked at an American company in Brazil as a chemist. Mm-hmm. And so he used my brother and me to practice his English. And as I also said, he loved Western and musicals, so I grew up like that, just learning English all the time, listening to English all the time. And my grandparents on my mom's side were Italian immigrants in Brazil. So I grew up listening to, growing up speaking Portuguese, of course, but listening to Italian, a lot of Italian words, and learning English from my dad. Yeah, so I just grew up like that, loving languages everywhere all the time.
And now your senior year, wasn't that spent in America?
Yes, as well, yes. I came to the United States when I was 18 in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. I attended a school called Middleburg High School in Middleburg, Pennsylvania, and I was an exchange student.
And you did a little trip, a very special trip.
Yes. Oh, yes. What a wonderful coincidence that my senior trip was to Washington, D.C. And next week I'm going to be going to Washington, D.C. again with the seniors this year.
Going with the
that's
seniors.
Wonderful.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Well, during your talk, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, get online and for the Trinity U and listen to Mrs. Banduk's talk. It is absolutely wonderful. You will fall in love with Latin by the end of it. That's all I can say. So take a listen to that. You focused on three misconceptions about studying Latin. Isn't Latin too difficult? Isn't Latin useless in today's world? And isn't Latin too focused on grammar? So let's take these one by one.
Okay.
Isn't Latin too difficult? Aren't there easier languages we could be teaching to students?
That's a wonderful, difficult question, actually, to answer. Because how do we determine whether a language is easy or difficult, right? Every language has things that are easy and things that are difficult. It can be grammar, spelling, pronunciation, to name a few things. I think English grammar is easy, but spelling and pronunciation are difficult. Latin grammar is more complex and detailed, but spelling and pronunciation are easier because Latin is a phonetic language.
Right.
In English, for example, the spelling O-U-G-H has 5 different sounds, if not more. It's insane. It's insane. What kind of spelling is this? When a person learns English, like, really, how do I learn how to spell?
The O-U-G-H phenomena. I had never thought of that. Tell us about that.
I know. It's very interesting. Thank you for asking that. Let me elaborate on that, definitely. So the O-U-G-H, right, has 5 pronunciations. For example, pronounce for me T-O-U-G-H.
Though.
Okay. Or at T. Oh, say, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, T-O-U-G-H.
T-O-U-G-H. Yeah.
T-H-O-U-G-H.
T-O-U-G-H.
That's tough.
That's tough. And then D-O-U-G-H.
Dough.
Sourdough. And then B-O-U-G-H.
Bow.
Mm-hmm. And then T-H-O-U-G-H-T.
There's thought.
Uh-huh. And T-H-R-O-U-G-H.
Through.
Really?
Holy moly.
So now you understand what I mean.
I see.
Right?
I cannot imagine learning that as a second language. I'd say
Yes.
throw, bow,
Exactly.
thought.
Exactly.
Wow, amazing.
Actually, there is a very funny episode of I Love Lucy when Ricky is learning how to read better in English because he wants to read for his son. They're expecting a baby. And so he's practicing reading, and he mispronounces all the words that are spelled with O-U-G-H. It's a very, very funny episode.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, how would we look that up on YouTube? Ricky mispronounces O-U-G-H on Lucy.
Yes.
That might be the right YouTube search.
I think so.
I'm doing it tonight when I get home. So we've kind of answered the question, is Latin too difficult? Wow, when we look at O-U-G-H in English, I think not. When do we start teaching them here?
We start teaching Latin at Trinity in 3rd grade.
Wow.
Yes.
And they pick it right up, I would guess.
They pick it right up, those little sponges that they are. You know, children love to sing. So we have a lot of chants in Latin, for what we call chants. You know, they're melodies that we use for the suffixes, nouns and verbs, and they just repeat that, and it becomes automatic.
So it sounds like the phonetics might be helpful, which kind of leads us into this second question. People say, oh, isn't Latin a dead language? Isn't it useless in today's world? How would you address that?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. For a Latin teacher, it's a little bit of, not really. But and yet, it's a wonderful question. You know, it's a valid question because Latin is not necessarily spoken a lot. It is spoken in the Vatican, for example. Actually, the Vatican, the ATM machines in the Vatican offer Latin as a language.
I remember seeing that when I was visiting.
Yes, and in academia, you know, you see professors speaking Latin or practicing their Latin. So, but in terms of it being useful, so I thought about the word useful. And when something is useful, we think about something being practical, applicable, or necessary. And useless, you know, being the opposite of these words. But so then I connected to Latin, and we can see that Latin is actually practical, applicable, necessary, and good. We use Latin every day. We do, all of us, whether we are aware of it or not. For example, in medicine, in law, in the sciences, in quotes, in books, and C.S. Lewis uses Latin all the time.
Sure.
And in the Romance languages, right, the children of Latin.
Yes.
I know. Yeah.
Well, and I have a periodic table behind me when I'm teaching, and one of the first questions the students always ask is, why are the symbols different from the name? And of course, because originally it was Latin. That was the language of science all the way through the 19th century. It didn't become English, German, and French until the 20th century.
Yeah.
All those scientific papers were written in Latin.
Yes.
So we see how it's functional. I also think it helps shape the mind, shape the thinking. And we see its use in phonetics, and like you said, it's just
everywhere,
inundated throughout our language, so
yes.
much so that it's you don't see the forest for the trees sometimes. It's so present in our languages. And so that brings us to this next question, though. It's very focused on grammar, and people say, oh, but isn't Latin too focused on grammar?
Yes. So that's the question?
Yes.
Grammar?
Is it?
I forgot to mention another thing about Latin being useful,
Sure.
again, that whether or not we are aware how much Latin we use every day, 50% of the words in English derive from Latin.
50%.
So yes, 50%.
Come on,
That's
people, get
amazing.
with your Latin out there. You're doing it anyway, even if you don't know it. So some of the folks out there may not be convinced. So how about some examples of this 50%? Do tell.
I will tell. Yes, it's fun. Let's have some fun playing Latin here. Let's see. So the word porto, for example, means to carry.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about the words portable, porter, port, import, export, it's all
Yes.
there. One word gives us 5, 6, 7 words.
That's amazing.
That's
It gives you a
amazing.
whole new perspective on the idea of a port, of an airport or a naval port. The whole idea is carry, because that's what's happening. These are being
Yes.
carried into it, carried out of it, transported
Transport,
away from
there
the
you are.
port.
They're
being
to
transported.
carry across.
Wow.
Transport, yes.
That's-
It's beautiful. It really
is beautiful. It's
Yes.
just so rich.
Yeah.
Well, what about another one? Let's have some more. Just lay them out
Yes,
there.
yeah. Let's see. For instance, I love this one. This is a beautiful one. The word astrum means star. And the word nauta means sailor.
Oh,
And so if you think about what an astronaut is, he's a sailor of the stars.
that is
It's a
fantastic.
beautiful word.
And of course, Star Trek, those are naval vessels.
Yes,
They're considered
nautical
sailing vessels.
sailing
Yeah, they're
vessels,
nautical
yeah.
terms.
They are sailors of the
Come on,
stars.
folks.
Yeah.
This is great. Roddenberry must have done his Latin research.
There you are. Another one, for instance, is the word where the word patience comes from. The word pati means to suffer. And so when we suffer, we should have patience. The movie, The Passion of Christ, the word passion means to suffer.
Yes.
So we're not talking necessarily about the love of Christ. It's the suffering of Christ for us, the passion of Christ.
Wow.
And couples should be compatible.
Compatible.
That means that they should suffer well together as a
It's- and-
couple through life.
And the whole
It's-
Christian idea is this idea of sharing the sufferings of Christ, and how
Yes.
in marriage one does that. In Christian partnerships, people do that. It's
yes.
just so
it's,
beautiful.
It's endless. It's endless. It's
Yeah.
really beautiful.
You got
Do you want
another
another one? I got another one.
Yeah.
Let's see. Since talking about having faith in Christ, the word credo means to believe.
Credo. believe.
Credo. So if we think about what a creed is, what we believe in, and
course.
if you borrow something and it is believed that you're going to pay back, you have credit.
Yes, or an idea has credence. to it.
Credence,
Something that's
yes,
worthy
yeah.
of our faith.
Yes, it's credible.
Yeah. the
Something
resurrection is
unbelievable.
credible.
It's credible or incredible.
Yeah.
It's
yes.
unbelievable.
Wow.
Yes, it's
It's just so
fascinating.
beautiful. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
I know for me, since I heard your talk, and then after our little discussion here, probably conversation. Does that have something to do with Latin?
Yes, actually it does.
Does
yeah.
it? Of course it does.
Yeah, the word verso, it means a verse.
Oh,
and
sure.
cum, the preposition cum, means with. So to converse, it's to verse together. It's to explore words together.
Oh, so
Verse,
imago
yeah.
Dei creature should be
Imago Dei creatures,
poetically-
that's another Latin right there.
poetically
yeah.
and creedally
Yeah.
compatible with one another. It's so
Indeed,
beautiful.
It's so beautiful.
Oh, and my point was, when I heard your talk and after our conversation, or with verse here we're having it, it really makes me want to just reflect on every word.
Every
and I wonder if
word,
did you ever
yes.
go through a period when you were learning Latin and studying it that like every sentence was just lighting your brain
yes,
up?
yes, indeed. Yes.
I'm glad
yes,
because that's been happening
yes.
to me since I heard your talk.
Yes,
It's
yes.
so beautiful. And so that brings us to the third question that you said you hear and that you brought up in your talk, which, by the way, folks, listen to the talk. Watch it online. And that is this. Isn't Latin too focused on grammar? How do you respond to that?
Okay. As a grammarian, it's easy for me to say that grammar is beautiful and wonderful. I think that our students, as they grow up, they start to admire and appreciate and understand grammar more. I don't know why grammar has a bad name, a bad reputation. But Latin, because Latin is different, Latin grammar is different from English grammar in terms of word order, for instance, or suffixes, for nouns, adjectives, verbs. Every word in Latin has a different ending, and we don't have that necessarily in English. We have singular and plural, period, you know. So because the grammar is so different, when we study Latin, not only we observe how languages work differently from each other, all languages, but also how that helps us come out of the English shell and see and admire other languages. Another thing that comes to mind is when we study the grammar of another language, in our case, Latin, at Trinity, Latin and Greek, 1 year of Greek, we become better at thinking about why one sentence sounds better or clearer or more beautiful than another sentence. It goes back to more than just words. It goes back to the construction, to the syntax of the sentence.
Sure.
And
the whole idea of connecting and communicating with fellow human beings in the best possible way, it increases that connectivity, ultimately, of course, for the sharing of the gospel, but sharing all good ideas and discussing ideas.
Yes. Clearer ideas if we can communicate well in the target language.
And so that reminds me of a term, which I'm sure you've heard, and that's the children of Latin. What's that all about?
Yes. Yes. Rome as a city, as an empire, acquired a lot of territory, and they all had to learn Latin.
Yes.
So they spoke their native language and Latin, and that became the children of Latin. For example, Portuguese, Spanish, and the Iberic Peninsula, and then French and Italian itself.
Yes, very similar.
Yes, up until Dante, when he wrote the Divine Comedy, people in the Italian Peninsula spoke different dialects. It wasn't really Italian. It was a little bit of this, a little bit of Latin, and then Dante wrote his work in Italian. So that became the official Italian.
Wow.
So we have what I call the children of Latin.
Sure, because that's what they are.
That's what they are, yes.
I mean, that's over a millennia.
Yes, they're siblings, for example, with the children of Latin.
Yes.
Right? So when we study Latin, without realizing, we are studying a little bit of the children, Spanish, Portuguese, French. For example, the word amor, that means love. It's a beautiful word.
Yes.
In Spanish and in Portuguese, it's amor. The word didn't change at all.
Wow.
In Italian, it became Italian, amore, very musical. Yeah, I love Italian. And then in French, it's more that nasal sound that French has. It became amour, like mon amour, my love. But the basic word is there. The Latin word is there.
The basic
word
word
amor.
just sounds like love.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
amor.
a heartbeat near your lover. It's just wonderful.
Yes, and with the expansion of Europe into the Americas, Latin was brought to America, to the Americas.
Yes.
3 Latin languages are spoken in the Americas, right? French and Spanish and Portuguese. And again, we have 50% of the words in English or Latin. So Latin is really, really, again, everywhere.
From the tip of Sud-America all the way up, we've got Latin inundating it. That's fantastic. Oh. Well, one of our favorite questions on this show, Mrs. Banduk, is to ask how what we study in classical Christian education is forming our students. So how does studying Latin form and develop our students who, as you said, start Latin in the 3rd grade?
As I said before, children love to repeat things. and they love songs. That's how I myself started learning English, with a lot of words. I remember asking my dad, how do you say dog in English? How do you say cat in English? How do you say whatever, any word in English? So it's just vocab. And we focus on vocab a lot in grammar school. So students are just learning all these words, and especially, words that children like. For example, snake. How do you say snake in Latin? Serpens. That's where we get serpent, of course.
Wow.
So they just learn words and words and words and those endings by all those Latin grammar chants that we do, like Shirley grammar in English. And then as they grow up, 6th grade and above, and they start reading the beautiful books that we read at Trinity, every time they see Latin, they're not afraid of it. Mm-hmm. That's another thing that Latin teaches our students, not to be afraid of words. Mm-hmm. They see a word in Latin, or they see a quote-unquote big word. They're not afraid of it. They go, oh, this must be Latin, or this is Latin. Let me see if I can figure it out.
How precious and valuable is that
Yep.
to learning not to be
afraid
of
of
words, so
words.
that you can communicate freely and clearly. That's
Yes.
beautiful. So to mix a child of Latin with Latin, Feliz Idus Martius. Happy Ides of March out there, folks. Lucy, it has been an absolute delight having you tonight. Thank you so very much for being with us.
Thank you for allowing me to share Latin with our community.
It's
Thank you.
a beautiful thing to share. We're so grateful. And thank you to all of you out there for joining us on the Classical Academy podcast, presented by Trinity U, a service of Trinity Classical Academy right here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music. So until next time, let's all continue to grow in wisdom, in virtue, and in the love of God. Thanks for being with us. Until next time.